Hello there, I'm Juliana Michaels and welcome to the Scrapbook.com YouTube channel. I'm so happy to be here and sharing with you all about embossing powders. There are so many different kinds of embossing powders out there that sometimes it can get a little confusing trying to figure out which one to use and what the differences are between them. Embossing powders are fast melting powders that are used in heat embossing. The powder is sprinkled on a slow drying or sticky ink and melted using a heat gun to add color, texture, dimension, and interest to a project. Embossing powders are divided into different categories based on the size of the powder, whether or not you can see through the melted powder, and then what color, specialty finish, or effect it has. The different sizes of the embossing powder granules are referred to as superfine, regular, and ultra thick. Superfine powders are really finely ground up, which makes them perfect to use with detailed stamped images. With regular embossing powders, the granules are a little larger, and this is what most embossing powders are. And then there are the ultra thick, and they are even larger, and this allows you to do a lot of really unique and special techniques because of how you can layer the powder to add even more texture and dimension. Next, embossing powders are either transparent or opaque. With transparent, you can see through it, so whatever is underneath it, whether it's a different color or an image or pattern, you're going to be able to see that through the melted powder. And with opaque, you can't see through it, so it's going to cover up whatever is underneath it. And then there are the different colors, finishes, and effects you can achieve depending on what is mixed together in the powder. They might be a mix of colors and textures, they can have glitter in them, they can be matte, they can have a pearlescent or metallic finish, they might have a bit of white pigment in them to give them a marbling effect. As you can see, there are lots of options out there when it comes to adding color, texture, dimension, and interest to a project. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on regular embossing powder, both transparent and opaque, as well as some of the various colors, finishes, and effects that are available. So to start off with, I've got a piece of Scrapbook.com's mixed media paper, and I'm putting just a little bit of a temporary adhesive here in the middle of my stamping platform, and I'm using that to just kind of help hold my paper in place. And reason being, I'm going to stamp onto the background with a really large kind of background stamp, and it's so big that you can't really use the magnets to help, so that's why I'm using that other adhesive. And this is the Simon Hurley handwritten stamp, and I'm going to stamp that with a archival ink. So this is just a permanent waterproof ink. You can use any kind of ink for this step if you're going to kind of follow along with what I'm doing here. But you don't need to do this, but I'm kind of doing it to show you what happens when you layer these different kinds of embossing powders over something that has like a pattern on it already. So you could also do this over pattern paper. So get that another good ink. And there we go. So anytime you're working with embossing powders, if you've done any other kind of stamping or inking on the background paper, you want to make sure that's completely dry before you start in on your embossing. Otherwise, you're going to have embossing powder that might stick in areas where you don't want it to be. So you want to let this dry. You can also rub over this with like an anti-static tool, but I'm just going to give this a quick dry. Even though archival ink does dry pretty quickly, just want to kind of speed that up for the video here. You might notice like on some of the jars, you're going to have letters that might tell you something more about the embossing powder. So on like the Wow brand, they will have like a T, and that means it's translucent, so you can see through this one. And then these are the opaque, and then the M is marbling. So there's kind of a mix of colors there, and then you kind of get a marbling effect once the powders are melted. And then some of them don't say, so you may just have to swatch them, which is what I like to do. So like this one here, this is a opaque embossing powder that it has a little bit of a shine to it, but it's a little less shiny than some of my other embossing powders. But this again is like an opaque one, And then this one is the embossing glaze from Ranger and Tim Holtz. And I think this product gets a little bit confusing for people, but it's just a translucent embossing powder. So it's similar to this one from Wow that has the T here that's translucent. This one just happens to have glitter in with the translucent, and this one is just the color with that's translucent. So they all give very different effects, and I'm going to be kind of swatching each one of these onto this background paper so you can kind of see what happens when you use these different kinds of embossing powders on paper that has like a color or a pattern on it. So I'm going to start off with the embossing ink, and I'm just going to apply some of that to this stamp here. And embossing ink is really just a sticky, slow drying ink, so it's almost like a glue that the powder can stick to. But if you don't have embossing ink, you could use any kind of a pigment ink. Just keep in mind that if it's colored, that is going to possibly impact what your final color is with your embossing powder, especially if it's translucent. So here we're going to I'm just going to stamp this across the top there. So I like to place a piece of copy paper underneath the paper that I'm working on, and then use that to kind of catch the excess powder. So I'm just going to pour this over that stamped area and then tap off the excess. And then you can kind of use this to funnel that excess powder back into the jar. And so this one is the opaque. And now I'm going to use my heat tool to melt that embossing powder and show you what happens as that powder melts. And then when you're using the heat tool, you just want to make sure when you turn it on that you give it some time to heat up and get to a full temperature. So, maybe 15-20 seconds. And then you're going to hold that and move it just slowly over the paper, kind of keeping it 4 to 5, 6 inches away from the paper and moving in just kind of a slow manner to slowly melt that powder. And you'll see it change from like this textured granule and it will slowly get smooth and a little bit more shiny. And so there you can see that you have a completely opaque effect here. This embossing powder completely covers up what's underneath it. So now we're going to move on to the next kind of embossing powder. This is another opaque powder, but this one is just like a solid color. So we're just going to stamp that image again here with our embossing ink. And then pour the embossing powder. And then you can kind of tap off some of that excess there onto your paper. And then again, kind of just use that to funnel it back into your jar. And then off camera there, actually what I'm doing is using a Swiffer duster to just wipe off some of that excess powder that still sticks to this paper so that I don't mix it in with my other powders when I work with them. And now we're going to repeat that heat embossing again. So as you can see, you can kind of see the ink through there, but not totally. So we're going to see what happens here as we heat this one. And as you can see here, we've definitely opaque. It completely covers up what's beneath there. So now we're going to move on to another one. This one is just another opaque marbling, but I wanted to kind of demonstrate this one too because it has, like this one gets pretty smooth even though it has a little bit of texture, and this one's super smooth. This one gets, it's like it stays textured when you, even after you melt the powder, which I think is super cool. especially if you like kind of a mixed media style, or you just like adding some extra texture and interest to your cards or projects. I think this is a really cool one. And I also find with these ones that have all these like mixture of colors and stuff, I kind of like to shake them up a little bit before I pour them, just to make sure everything's mixed in really well together. We'll sprinkle that one on. Tap off the excess. And this one definitely has some glitter in it as well. It's got a lot of sparkle and shine along with the texture. And then with these ones that start getting a little more texture to them, you can also heat them from the back side. Like if you're noticing that when you turn your heat gun on, everything seems to be like flying off. It could be that your ink pad that you're using is not juicy enough, so you do want to make sure you've either re-inked your ink pad or you have a new one if your other one's dried up. So the ink, if you've got a good ink pad and it's still kind of flying off, sometimes you might want to heat from the bottom, and that will kind of help with things flying off and blowing off because the heat's not directly onto it. There you can see that opaque embossing powder is covering up what's underneath it. So you can't really see what's, that stamping that's underneath it. You can see what's here on the edges because of the stamp design, but not what's underneath there. So now we're going to move on to ones that are translucent and kind of show you what happens there, like the difference we're going to start seeing. And we'll stamp our little image again here with our embossing ink. And this one here is the embossing glaze. And just don't let that confuse you, the name there, because it's really just translucent embossing powder. And you can already see right there, just when the powder goes on, you can still see what you have underneath there. So if you are using pattern paper or stamp design or a stencil design, you're going to be able to see what's underneath there. Another thing with the translucent embossing powders is what color you have underneath there. Here I'm using two colors that are pretty closely related to each other, so they go well together for sure. So if you were stamping in like purple, for instance, and then you put this kind of blue-green color on top of it, you're going to get a different effect. That ink isn't going to look purple. It's going to look like purple mixed with the blue and the green. So the options of what you can get when you start mixing colors is really unlimited. And at that point, I would kind of suggest that you think about like the color wheel when you're working with colors, which is why I a lot of times like to go with colors that are either like this, where it's kind of tone on tone, or you can go with colors that are like next to each other on the color wheel. So you stick with like blues and greens and yellows maybe, or you could even go blue, green, and into the purples and still get a really cool effect. If you start adding in pinks or oranges, you might start getting totally different colors that could be to your liking or not. So I would always say, if you're not sure when you're layering a translucent embossing powder, do a little test on a scrap of paper somewhere and see if it's going to give you the look and effect that you're looking for. And now I'm going to heat emboss the embossing glaze translucent powder here. And there you can see it's melted, and you can still see what's underneath there, and gives you a totally different effect versus this one up here where you can't see what's underneath there. All right, so lastly, we're going to do one more translucent powder here. And this is got some glitter in it, as you can see here. So I'll give that a little shake. And again, you don't need to shake up all your embossing powders, but the ones that have like a mix of like the more specialty ones that aren't just like this one's just plain clear and this one's just solid. But when you start getting the glitter and the different micas and powders in there, you want to mix them up a little bit just to make sure you're getting kind of an even amount of everything. And then here you can see like this one that's translucent, this one that's translucent, you can still see what is underneath there. Like with these other ones, when you put the powder on, you couldn't even really see through the powder as well anymore. So that also is another indication that you probably have a translucent powder versus an opaque powder, if you can see through it. And now I'm going to heat emboss this one. When you're doing this, if you're finding that your hand's getting too hot from like holding the paper, grab some tweezers and you can hold your paper that way. Just another way to help protect your hands if you're sensitive to the heat. So there is a look at that translucent glitter one. And I will say some of these ones that are glitter, like only glitter based, are a little bit more difficult to tell if the powder is completely melted. So if you're not totally sure, after you've heat embossed it, give it the paper just a few seconds to cool, and the powder to cool, and then you can kind of move it back and forth and sometimes even just touch it a little bit and see like, are there any areas that I missed or that don't look shiny and melted if I tilt it in the light a little bit. And then you can just go back and add a little more heat to those areas and finish the melting. So there's kind of a look at just some different types of embossing powders that are out there that will give you different effects depending on how you want to use them. So now we're going to do some heat embossing using a stencil. So here I'm got another piece of white cardstock that I've stamped an image on. Again, I've used the Archival ink. You could use any other kind of ink you like. I just find that the Archival ink doesn't bleed, where a water-based ink will bleed just slightly when you apply the VersaMark or any kind of embossing ink over it. And I'm going to apply just a little bit of a temporary adhesive here to the back of that paper to help hold it in place on my craft mat. And then I'm going to place my stencil over that. And I'm going to use a little bit of mint tape here to help hold this stencil in place. And then I'm going to apply the ink using this little foam dauber. And I'm just going to pounce that onto my ink pad to pick up the ink. And then I'm just going to pounce that through the stencil over the design. You also want to make sure that whatever ink if you're stamping onto your background paper, you again want to make sure that that's completely dry before you start doing the embossing steps. Otherwise you're going to get potential for the powder to stick in areas that you don't want it to stick. So now we're going to just lift this up. And pour some of the embossing powder over the surface here. And the one here we're going to start with is this Turquoise Antiquities from Ranger. And it, as you'll see, has kind of that mix of pigments and colors to it to give it a really cool mixed media effect. And if you do happen to get some powder, like maybe where you don't want it, you can just take a small brush and just kind of brush away that excess powder. I mean, I don't find it to be troublesome in this kind of situation, but if you're stamping like a sentiment or something, then you might want to have a little brush handy for that. And then we're going to heat emboss this as before. And there is a look at how that embossing powder works. And this one, as you can see, is an opaque embossing powder. It completely covers up that stamping that was underneath the stencil. So even though it looks like, oh, maybe you can see through it, because it's really kind of a fooling your eye because the color of this ink and that embossing powder are so similar. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the stencil and line it back up with our design from before and continue on. So I'll add some more ink here. And when you're doing this, like through a stencil this way, I do not recommend using one of those sticky mats because it's just going to be really hard to clean the embossing powder off of it. Now the next one here I've got is this Wow embossing powder, vintage turquoise, and it has that T on it. So this says it's going to be translucent. So it's got all these different colors and pigments and things in there. So we're going to give that a little shake just to make sure it's mixed together nicely. So you can still see through it. So let's see what happens as we heat emboss it. And there you can see, it's definitely translucent. You can still see that stamping through it, but you still get that really cool mixed media vibe with that kind of metallic shimmer through there. And then the way it layered on top of that other powder really kind of gives you a cool little effect there as well. So mixing and matching your embossing powders is also another fun way to use them. We're going to add another little strip here and go on to see what this next one does. And here we're doing the embossing glaze again. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a translucent powder. So you can see through it still, even before we heat it. And so we're going to heat emboss that now. And again, you can see through to that stamped design. And now we're going to add one final section here. And this is called Teal Tinsel, and this is kind of a glitter embossing powder. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes with these glitter ones, it's a little bit more difficult to see the powder melting. So, you know, just kind of maybe need to tilt it and make sure you get a good light source on there so you can see if it's changing and melting the powder. And so there's a look at that one melted, and it's really hard with some of these glitter ones to tell like if the powder's melted. So after you've heated it, if it looks like it's melted, let it cool for a few seconds, and then you can kind of touch it and see. I do find some of these glitter ones do kind of rub off a little bit, but if you make sure you heat it really well, everything's melted, and then just kind of lightly brush over it to remove any of the excess glitter, and then it should, at some point, you'll have all the glitter that's going to be attached, and it'll stick just fine and won't continue rubbing off. But as you can see, this one also is more of an opaque finish, so you can't really see through it like you can here with these middle two. It's definitely much more opaque like that top one there. And so here is a look at the different embossing powder types on a stamped background with a stencil. Another fun way you can use the embossing powders through the stencil is to add like details to your die cut. So for instance, this particular die comes with a layering stencil, and I just applied that same embossing ink like I did in the previous example. Applied that ink through the stencil and then added the embossing powder in the color that I wanted. And you just want to make sure that the ink, so if you've inked your image below using the stencils, you just want to make sure that that ink is completely dry before you do that embossing step. So that's just another little way to add some shimmer and shine to your die cuts. And you could, do that with any of the finishes. If you wanted just to do like a clear embossing glaze and don't want the glitter effect, or if you wanted more of that mixed media effect, you could add any of those kind of mixed media styled ones. And, really just the options are limitless when it comes to what you can do with them. So lastly, what I wanted to do was share with you how you can get your own colored embossing powder if you don't have all the colors. And then all you need is pigment ink and a clear embossing powder. So the pigment ink is also a slow drying ink. So remember, any kind of a slow drying ink, which is typically a pigment ink or like the watermark inks or the embossing inks. And because they dry slow, embossing powders will stick to them. So now we're stamping in a color. So if you want to just make sure you get a good impression with it, you need to stamp it more than once you can. And then now we're just going to pour some clear embossing powder over this. And if you get a little bit of powder in some areas where you don't want it, you could either use like an anti-static tool, or you can just get a little brush and get in there and kind of wipe off some of that excess. Tap it gently. But the nice thing about the clear embossing powder is you're not going to see it like you would like a colored embossing powder. And now I'm going to heat emboss this. And so there with the sentiment, you can see how that really just adds a different effect to your sentiment. So kind of makes them a little more polished and stand out a little bit more when you add that layer with the embossing powder. So, and it also looks like you used colored embossing powder when you didn't. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration of some of the various regular embossing powders that are available, the differences between them, and that you feel more confident in selecting and using them. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend.